In the 1960s, the developer Jim Rouse designed what was to be the perfect community that we have all come to know and love as Columbia, Maryland. Rouse envisioned a place in which people of diverse economic backgrounds, races, and faiths would all come together to live as one. Smaller neighborhoods would form around village centers, and village centers would form around a town center, all giving Columbia both a cosmopolitan and a small town feel. There was only one problem. Once Columbia was up and running, they discovered that they had neglected to include a very important ingredient: a cemetery. Apparently, Columbia was to be so perfect that no one was ever going to die. Well, that flaw was quickly remedied, and there now is a cemetery on the outskirts of Columbia on Route 108. But it highlights a significant reality about our society. We are a death-denying culture. We'd much rather talk about energy and vitality than sickness and death. And as a result, it's hard to preach resurrection and new life to a culture that denies death and dying. Today's story of the raising of Lazarus is probably the most sustained story about death in the New Testament, other than perhaps the death of Jesus himself. Jesus lived at a time when people were all too well aware of the reality of death. In those days, as in many parts of our world today, people routinely died as infants and children and young people. And they died from disease and famine and violence. And yet, even in today's story, we see attempts to deny death and Jesus' struggle to proclaim new life. So let's take a moment to look at our story. Got your Bibles? You got your missals? If you don't got your missals, we got more of them back there if you want to cough up $5. Just a little commercial. So, the story of the raising of Lazarus is in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 1. So as you look at the beginning of the story, we see that St. John introduces us to the major characters: Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. We'd met them before, but he reminds us of who they are, that they are sisters and brother. And then he tells us that Lazarus is taken ill, so that his two sisters send word to Jesus about his illness, presumably with the hope that Jesus will return and cure his friend, Lazarus, as he's cured so many people. And when Jesus receives word of Lazarus' illness, he says something that might seem a little odd. Verse 4, "This illness is not to end in death, but is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now, if you think about last week's story of the man born blind, Jesus' response here is very similar to the response he gave when the disciples asked him, who sinned, this blind man or his parents, that he was blind from birth? And there Jesus says, that's in chapter 9, verse 3, he says, neither he nor his parents sinned. It is so that the works of God might be made visible through him. So you see, from the very beginning of this story of Lazarus, Jesus knows what he's going to do. He knows what's going to happen and how he's going to respond to it. And that's important. Keep that in the back of your mind as we move through the story. So Jesus delays, Lazarus dies, and ultimately he arrives in Bethany, St. John tells us in verse 17, when Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now that's significant because you see, there had been stories of Jesus raising other people from the dead. But because he raised them before they were buried, and Jews buried their dead within 24 hours of death, there were doubts as to whether those people were actually dead. And so some people said that Jesus never raised anyone from the dead. He simply cured people who appeared to be dead. So St. John is telling us very clearly that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. He dead. And there's no doubt about it. So when Martha hears that Jesus is in town, this is the same Martha and Mary of the one who was running around doing all of the chores and speaking her mind, she runs out to Jesus. And you can imagine her maybe shaking her fist or wagging her finger at him saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would never have died. She's upset. She's hurt. She's grieving. She's angry. And don't we all feel those same emotions in face of death? She wants to know, where was he? Because if he had been there, then she would not have to face death. And in fact, she's kind of already denying the reality of death just by thinking that if something had been different, Lazarus wouldn't have died. Because someday, eventually, Lazarus is going to die. We're all going to die. And so how often do we try to deny that, thinking that if something were just different, we would have lived? Well, there's only so often that God can cure until it's our time to move on. And so Jesus, understanding that Martha is clearly upset and not yet ready to accept Lazarus' death, he says to her, your brother will rise. And Martha responds in verse 24, I know he will rise in the resurrection on the last day. Basically, she's saying, look, I know what our faith teaches us, but that's not going to happen until the end of time. I'm hurting now. I need my brother now. What good is the last day now? And so Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. Not I will be the resurrection and the life. New life can come now because I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is not simply about bringing life at the end of time. Jesus is about bringing new life here and now, all the time. Do you believe this? He asks. And she says in verse 27, "Yes, Lord, I have come to believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who is coming into the world." Martha, at this point in the story, makes a profound profession of faith in Jesus as the Christ. Now, in all of the stories of John that we have heard to up until this point, that's where the story would have ended. Because in each of the stories, Jesus is trying to bring the person to faith in him. And once they acknowledge Jesus as the Christ, the story ends. But not with death. When the story is about death, it continues even after a profession of faith. You see, and that is the first harsh reality about death. Even though we profess faith in Jesus Christ, that does not end the story. That does not end the pain or the struggle that we're facing. The death of another person does not end our lives. The story continues. And so it does with Martha and Mary. Martha tells Mary of Jesus' presence. She rushes to him. This time she's not so much wagging her finger or shaking her fist, but falls at his feet. Remember, this was the Mary who sat at the feet of Jesus. And she, though, says pretty much the same thing. If you had been here, my brother would never have died. She, too, is not yet ready to accept the reality of death. And then John tells us in verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, he became perturbed and deeply troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And then they said to him, "Sir, come and see." And then St. John pens the shortest verse in all of the Bible. And Jesus wept. Jesus wept. The Jews see him weeping, and they conclude, see how much he loved him. But others said, if he loved him that much, could he have not done something to prevent him from dying? But my question is that really why Jesus wept? Did Jesus weep because Lazarus died? How could that have been if Jesus knew from the beginning that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead? If he knew that this death was not going to end here? Keep that in the back of your mind. Why did Jesus weep? So, perturbed again, the story says, they go to the tomb. Now, there's no denying death. in that tomb is not only Mary and Martha's brother, but all of their hopes and the dreams that they may have had together that they've lost with his death, all of the security and the confidence that they may have had as a family of brother and sisters together, all of the regrets that they may still have that they didn't say certain things that they wanted to say, they didn't resolve certain arguments that they had. It's all in that tomb. And now that we're at the tomb, there is no denying death. And Jesus says, "Take away the stone." And Martha immediately objects. "Lord, by now there will be a stench. He has been dead for 4 days. What possible good could it be to open this tomb and see the pain and the hurt and the loss and the grief? What value could there be in exposing it to the light?" And then Jesus says to her, and you can hear the frustration in his voice, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" You see, to me, this is the key to understanding Jesus' emotions. Jesus is frustrated. Jesus is weeping because he knows he can bring life to Lazarus, his friend. But what he can't seem to do is to bring faith to his friends in himself. He weeps for their pain because they can't believe that he has the power to bring life to death. You see, it seems to me the whole point of the story is not whether Jesus has the power to bring new life to death. We know that he has. The point of the story is whether we can understand the power of believing that Jesus can bring new life to death. Because so often in our lives, whether it is an actual death or whether it's a death of our sense of self, whether it's a dead end that we've reached because of relationships, because of failed tests or failed attempts, whatever it is dead, we fail to believe that Christ can bring new life to it. But you see, Jesus can only bring new life to the situation if we have the faith to take away the stone and to expose that pain to the light. Whether it is the death of a loved one, whether it is addictions that we're struggling with, whether it is hurt that we have caused on others, whether it is our own paralysis in overwhelming circumstances. If we leave that stone in place, it remains entombed in us. Take away the stone. There may be a stench, but there is new life lurking behind it. You see, when we deny the reality of death, when we deny the true grief and pain and brokenness in our lives, when we seal it in that tomb, we are saying that we do not believe that Jesus has the power to bring new life. Take away the stone. let the light of the world, Jesus Christ himself, in, and listen to his call, Lazarus, come out. Because you see, Mary and Martha received new life in the raising of Lazarus, just as much as Lazarus himself. Jesus gave them all the opportunity to try again, to live again. It will be different than it ever was. But new life is not just promised to those who pass away. New life is promised to those of us who continue the story. So you see, there's no point in denying death. It's a reality of life. Whether you're designing Columbia, Maryland, or whether you are just trying to navigate the ins and outs of life. It's hard to believe in new life if you won't accept death. Only when we can confront that in our lives and expose it to the light of the world can we ever hope to move beyond that which holds us back. Only when we turn our loss and our pain and our fear over to Jesus can we ever hope of having him heal them. Only when we can believe in Jesus while we are standing at that tomb can we ever hope to hear him say, "Untie him and set him free." Amen. Amen.